We're ready for the very last sentence of Second Timothy. Second Timothy chapter 4, verse 22. Last time we talked about the Lord be with your spirit. There's just lots to think about and dwell on in terms of your spirit. Then his final words to Timothy in this letter: grace be with you all. Now, that phrase, or basically the two words, be with. I grew up hearing that included in every public prayer. Lord, be with us. And I don't know, somewhere in my late 20s, I think, I heard a guy named Juan Carlos Ortiz give a talk in which he talked about us praying that way. And he said, that's kind of doesn't make much sense. Think about this. Well, if God is who he says he is, and he will never leave us, he will never forsake us, and in some mystical way, where two or three are gathered in his name, Jesus said, I am there in your midst. If that's true, then us saying, Lord, be with us, is like me coming to your house on your invitation and me sitting down and saying to you, be with me, be with me. The silliness is, you're already with me. Now, I am going to interpret what Paul wrote, grace be with you all. And I wish I knew Greek in a way that I could say, and this is how you can also translate this more accurately. I don't know that that's the case. But Paul knew a lot about God's grace. Nobody in the New Testament wrote as much about God's grace as the Apostle Paul. I think Paul knew that God's grace was with us, in us, around us, being poured out on us, non-stop, constantly, because wherever God's presence is, and that's everywhere, his grace is there too. I think it's possible that what Paul, here I'm telling you what Paul meant, I don't know. But what about this? Maybe. What Paul meant is God's grace is with you all. It's almost like he's saying, don't ever forget this. I mean, Timothy, this is the last thing I'm going to write, because I want, if you don't get or remember the rest, I want you to get this and remember it. God's grace is with you. And this is a strong indicator that Paul understood that when Timothy received this letter, it was going to be read to the church in Ephesus. Oh, and by the way, not just to the church at Ephesus, but to all the churches, congregations in the area. It would have been a circular letter in that it was circulated. A couple of possibilities. One is the actual original was circulated. Second is the original was copied meticulously, and these copies went out to the other churches in the region. At any rate, Paul knew that This was for Timothy and the church, and by extension, for us today. Pardon me. Grace is with you. Because this is true, there are realities that we need to, I would even go so far as to say we must embrace, because this is true. One of the ways from my counseling perspective to talk about this is to say, if God's grace is with me, we believe it is, then how would I act? Now, yes, there is the aspect of how would I feel, but years ago, many years ago, I heard I think it was my advisor in my master's program said, you can much more effectively act your way to a different feeling than feel your way to a different action. I believe that's true. I don't think feelings are insignificant. They're huge. They're very important. But don't start there. Start with, if God's grace is with me, then how would I behave? How would I act? What would I do? One of my favorite questions for counselees and clients is, what would that look like? Okay, so I'm going to ask that of you. Because God's grace is with you, what does that look like? Well, I'm going to answer it from my perspective about me, and I don't know, I'd like to think that most of this would apply to all of us in God's family, but you need to contemplate this for yourself. For me, it begins with, because God's grace is with me, I will treat myself with grace. There's a difference between treating myself with grace and excusing all my bad behavior. That's not grace. See, God doesn't just go, oh, what bad behavior? No. See, grace says, yeah, that was a bad behavior. I'm forgiving you. I am renewing you. So I know this sounds selfish and self-centered. What it looks like for me to live and knowing and acting as if God's grace is with me. It begins with treating myself with grace. And one of the strongest applications of that is I am learning to forgive myself. I could go deeply into that and spend a long time talking about why is forgiving myself important? How do I forgive myself? I'm not going to go there. Much of it is just self-evident. If I can't, or if I don't forgive myself, that whatever needs forgiving will hold me back. You see, it's so normal, I would say natural, to be held hostage by unforgiven things. And this truly applies to our relationship with ourselves. So I begin with God's grace. When I know that God's grace is with me, I will treat myself with grace. Does that mean, oh, man, I don't even have to try anymore because it's all about grace? I've said it a gazillion times. I'll say it again. You see, what I do with God's grace and about God's grace doesn't result in me getting God's grace. I do these things because I have received God's grace. It's grace, then, is the motivating power to act in ways that are consistent with His grace. So, it starts with me treating me with grace and quickly moves on to me treating you with grace. Does that mean that I pretend that what you said or did that was wrong isn't wrong? No. What it means is, because of God's grace at work in my life, I can engage in the process of choosing to forgive those who hurt me. Okay? Treating them with kindness and dignity and respect. These grace behaviors, they're summed up by Paul in the book of Galatians, where he writes about the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. 9 virtues. Because God's grace is with me, I now have a power to behave with love, to experience and express joy, to experience peace, to demonstrate patience, and all the way down every single one of these virtues, beginning in love and capped off with self-control. That's not by accident, in my opinion. I don't think Paul just started throwing out randomly these, things. It begins in love, and the capper, these bookends, love and self-control. You do realize that for the follower of Jesus, self-control is the result of God's grace. We don't get God's grace because we demonstrate self-control. No, it's virtually the opposite of that. We demonstrate self-control because of God's grace at work in us. And when I am not demonstrating any one of these virtues, let's pick on self-control. The big reason is because I am somehow turning away God's grace. And I know, but for me, it comes down to, I am not letting God's grace be with me. I'm pushing it away somehow. And so when I notice the lack in these virtues, my first question has got to be not so much who did this to me, which is normally my first, that's my first impulse. But the question then really should be, how am I pushing God's grace away? When I live with God's grace, I have a hunger for Him, for His Word, conversations with Him, conversations with others. Every aspect of my life is touched and affected by God's grace. And so my challenge closing challenge from 2 Timothy is, what's it look like for you to live with God's grace? Don't know where I'm going to go next time, but I'll at least have next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.